Throughout history, human beings have sought a balance between personal liberty and security. Individuals quickly realized that some form of collective order, or government, was necessary to protect their rights and property. But long and tragic experience taught a critical lesson. The very government societies created to protect themselves frequently became the greatest threat to freedom and security. To avoid this, the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans created limited governments based on written laws. Generations of citizens were able to live secure, free, and prosperous lives. With the passage of time, many things change. Civilizations rise and fall. But human nature remains constant, as do the principles of sound government. America's founding fathers understood human nature. In forming a new government, they studied the experience of the ancients and applied the lessons in creating history's most successful experiment in liberty, the American constitutional system. A key principle was that political power had to be limited by law and divided among many branches of government. The essential insight of the new system is that no man or ruling elite can be trusted with total power.
If it were possible to trust one individual with a sort of benign kingship, then that would be a very nice state of affairs. But the reality is that human beings are corruptible, and if you dissect Lord Acton's famous quote, he said, "Power tends to corrupt," so that's a tendency. But then he went on to say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's not a tendency, it is a given.
The Founding Fathers created a system in which typical, common, run-of-the-mill men exercising power would have to be accountable to law and accountable to the governed.
Following the principles contained in the Constitution, the U.S. became the freest, strongest, and most prosperous society in human history. Throughout the rest of the world, most nations have followed a course different from America. Poverty, war, and terror are the sad but common lot for much of humanity. Eager to put an end to such suffering, many people embraced an institution promising to bring about world peace and global justice: the United Nations. Presented to Americans as mankind's last, best hope for peace. In classrooms across America, children are taught that the UN was created by benevolent men to put an end to war and to bring nations together to solve problems. But since the UN's founding in 1945, mankind has continued to experience world conflict, injustice, and war. Political scientist R.J. Rummel estimates that in subsequent decades, more than 35 million people have been murdered by their own governments. Communist governments in countries such as China, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe have used famine as a weapon. In the Balkans, Rwanda, Somalia, and Sierra Leone, civil war has killed tens of thousands. Ironically, most of the governments responsible for such atrocities are also UN members. The 190-odd member states of the UN represent a variety of governing philosophies.
The governments represented in the United Nations really are incompatible with the United States on many levels. First of all, the governments do not represent the peoples that they supposedly are supposed to represent at the United Nations. Very few of them are elected. Very few of them have any constraints upon their power. Most of them are statist of one kind or another. They're fascist, socialist, or communist in nature.
For the most part, the dominant philosophy of the nations represented in the General Assembly would have to be considered state socialism, and a large number of them, perhaps even a large plurality of the nations in the General Assembly, are wholly owned subsidiaries of the International Monetary Fund, hopelessly in hock to the United Nations financial organs.
Nations with governing philosophies broadly similar to America's are a small minority in the UN. The Charter of the United Nations is the world body's defining document. Its principles are far different than those that support the American system of government.
The United Nations Charter was designed by individuals who intended from the very beginning that the United Nations would have none of the checks and balances that we have in our constitutional system, but on the contrary, that it would be an open-ended document and an open-ended process which would continue to centralize and accumulate power.
The differences between the two systems are fundamental. The Bill of Rights forbids Congress to restrict freedom of speech, religion, assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, and so on. By contrast, the UN's International Covenants on Human Rights authorizes limitations on rights, if those limits are prescribed by law. For example, Article 29 in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights specifies that rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations.
The United Nations Charter does not recognize any power higher than that of the United Nations itself. They do not recognize that they have to answer to the people in whose name they supposedly rule, or the Creator who invested those people with rights. And so the contrast in visions between the U.S. constitutional system and the UN system can be summarized in the fact that, unlike the United States government and the Constitution that governs our government, the UN does not recognize any authority above itself.
A fundamental UN principle, it would seem, decrees that rights are a gift from government, not from God. Most Americans think of the UN merely in terms of its diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. But the UN also serves as the hub of a large and growing network of global institutions intended to govern a wide range of human activity. UNESCO, the UN's Education and Scientific Committee, establishes global standards for the education of children, including those in American classrooms. The UN-connected World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which receives billions from U.S. taxpayers, controls much of the world's economy. The UN Environmental Program and other UN agencies set global standards that define land use, property rights, and economic development policies in America and elsewhere. There are UN programs dealing with the planet's seas and oceans, the world's deserts, industry, trade, labor, energy, the atom, and even politics.
One of the most radical developments at the United Nations is the institution of the International Criminal Court. The court's ability to amend and to expand its authority is virtually unlimited. It has none of the checks and balances that we have built into our system. It is truly a frightening monstrosity.
Over the last 4 or 5 years, the United Nations has explicitly stated its objective of taking all small arms and bringing them under the control of national governments and the UN itself. And this would necessarily involve the confiscation of all firearms from civilian gun owners worldwide.
The number and size of UN programs and committees are virtually unlimited. Directly or indirectly, they affect every individual on Earth. And the effects have not always been positive.
We've begun to see the United Nations not being just a forum for debate and diplomacy, but it is actually gaining institutions of power, legislative, executive, and judicial powers backed up by military and police force. And this is a very frightening thing when you consider all of the tyrannical, dictatorial, and terrorist regimes which are part of this whole mix there. They're going to be exercising power, and when you see that the United States is subordinating our military, our police powers, to the United Nations, then you see that this could be a very, very dangerous road for us.
Shortly after the September 11th terrorist attack, the UN elected Syria, a regime listed by the U.S. State Department as a terrorist sponsoring state, to a rotating position on the UN Security Council. Yet the Security Council is entrusted with managing the fight against terrorism. In early 2003, the UN overwhelmingly voted to have Libya, another terrorist regime, chair its Human Rights Commission. The commission supposedly acts as a watchdog for human rights abuses. Libya would chair the Human Rights Commission, composed of representatives from Syria, Cuba, Sudan, and China. These regimes also have little regard for human rights.
Defenders of the United Nations say that in the interest of world peace, everybody has to be represented at the table. That's why we have such disagreeable regimes, for instance, as Libya and Syria and Iraq, represented in the General Assembly and sometimes in the Security Council. And if the United Nations were merely a harmless discussion club, I suppose that would make sense. But the problem here is that when nations and regimes of that sort are elected to the Security Council, they belong to the body that, according to the UN, is the apex decision-making body for the entire world.
That is tantamount to inviting the mafia into our courts and our prosecutors, into our police departments, and thinking we were going to get any kind of justice out of that.
As far back as the 1960s, some Americans argued that the United States should never have joined the United Nations. Still, most Americans initially felt that the UN played a somewhat useful role. A 1959 Gallup poll indicated that 87% of Americans believed that the UN was doing a good job. But the increasingly anti-American makeup of the UN gradually became understood. By 1980, the number of Americans who felt that the UN was doing a good job had fallen to 31%. Faith in the UN was diminishing. U.S. withdrawal from the UN, once considered far-fetched, emerged as a topic of reasonable discussion. The UN relies almost entirely on American resources and military might. Therefore, U.S. withdrawal translated to UN collapse. The heated debate was sparked.
The question is the same to you as I just asked Edward. Should the United States be in the United Nations?
No, it should not. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, you find that our contention is that rights come from God and governments should be limited. Never should have gotten involved, and we should get out post-haste.
You know what is going to freeze over before that happens, okay?
And it's not the job of the United States to settle the squabbles in Bosnia or to settle the squabbles in the Middle East and so on. It's the job of the United States to protect the lives, liberty, and property of this country, and that's it.
Sending a strong message to the U.S. government. That message, get out of the United Nations. This resolution now goes to the full House for a vote, but it does not
require a message to Washington to withdraw from the UN. As you can imagine, this proposal is raising a few eyebrows on Capitol Hill and according to our poll across the state as well. However, our survey also shows a lot of people aren't too thrilled with the UN in a lot of ways either.
The fate of the United Nations found itself being determined in the halls of American government. In 1997, a measure calling for the termination of the United States membership in the UN came before the House of Representatives. 54 members voted in favor. 2 years later, 74 voted to cease all funding for the UN. Although far short of the necessary majority, support in Congress for U.S. withdrawal gains momentum.
Peacekeeping today is a lot tougher and more difficult than it has been.
Proponents argue, without a UN, how could the nations of the world resolve problems of common concern? David Sheffer, a UN ambassador at large, insists that only through the UN can effective international deliberation occur.
If we didn't have the United Nations, we'd literally have to invent it again, because we'd have to bring all of these governments together to discuss these issues and arrive at decisions about how to tackle these problems. They must be dealt with in this sort of organizational framework.
Before there was a UN, we got together with other nations, 2 or more, on various issues that concerned us. And if the United Nations were gone, we would continue doing that. And the argument from history is that we would be far more successful. The United Nations can point to very few successful programs where genuine problems have been solved through the United Nations.
When people get up before the General Assembly and make incendiary speeches at the expense of others, they're not advancing the cause of diplomacy. They're not advancing the cause of world peace. By and large, the productive work of diplomacy is done very quietly, one-on-one or in small groups, outside of the glare of publicity.
Yet agencies attached to the UN do a great deal of humanitarian work. Many people wonder what would become of such relief efforts if the UN were abolished.
Has there been good done by the World Health Organization and some adjuncts of the UN? Yes. Would it be done without the UN? Yes. In fact, most of the wherewithal for those programs has come from us, from the American taxpayers.
It's private charitable organizations that are involved in the hands-on business of ministering to the hungry and to the sick and to the destitute, and they do so without exacting the political surcharge that inevitably is part of government-sponsored charity, including UN charity.
In the face of increasing disenchantment with UN performance, supporters insisted that the UN be allowed to fulfill the vision of its founders.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Proponents promise a world of peace, security, and justice if only the UN is given sufficient support and authority.
Today we must develop federal structures on a global level. To deal with world problems, we need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government.
Some supporters were even more enthusiastic about the prospects for world government. Robert Wright of the New Republic writes, "America is surrendering its sovereignty to a world government. Hooray! World government is coming. Deal with it." But the actual plans for a UN world government were developed in secrecy, and the ultimate aims remain largely hidden from the general public today. Yet, in a foreign edition of Newsweek, senior editor Michael Hirsch was surprisingly candid about this deception. The internationalists were always hard at work in quiet places, making plans for a more perfect global community. They haven't bragged about their globe building for fear of reawakening our berserker nationalism, and so they have always done it in the most out-of-the-way places and with little to do.
The founders of the United Nations, unlike the founders of the United States, understood that they could not sell their product to the American people because they knew that the native intelligence of the American people would lead us to reject the proposal of doing away with our independence and embracing a completely contradictory vision of government.
Opponents of world government affirm that misleading the public into giving up national sovereignty can't possibly serve the interests of liberty.
On behalf of the United Nations, I express my gratitude to the multinational force and to the United States of America.
Consolidation of governing power into a world body would override the rules established by local cultures. Global government also means that the governed would be forced to live under rules set by distant bureaucrats who don't necessarily have to abide by them. The Founding Fathers used a word to describe such remote, consolidated, and arbitrary power: tyranny.
Some of the scaremongers have proposed that the UN is going to one day soon send blue-helmeted troops to rampage across American soil and shut down our liberties. Well, that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is that our leaders are delivering us into the United Nations.
Some people think that our own government is going to protect us from the threat the United Nations represents. They don't understand that the United Nations, to ambitious men within our government, represents a way that they can enhance their own power outside of the channels of accountability contained in our Constitution.
If we give up our sovereignty, that means that we give up our independence, our ability to act within that framework which has given us the freedom, the prosperity, and all of those things which are so dear to us as Americans.
Americans do have a choice. They can do nothing and let others decide what kind of government they will live under, or they can get involved.
Citizens have to understand, first of all, the nature of the threat and the nature of the solution. And the solution resides in our Constitution. And if our Constitution, which limits government power, is going to be enforced, it will have to be enforced by principled, organized efforts of informed citizens to do so.
At stake is the American heritage for which so many have labored and sacrificed. Will future generations of Americans live in freedom? Or will they suffer the oppression of tyranny? The answer depends on you.